to pick them by lot. However, we know in some places in this country they have manipulated this, and in other places they have followed the law. In Montana, back about 1979 or 80, I was talking to the U.S. Attorney, and he told me, he said, Red, he says, we have held the last federal grand jury over an additional 6 months because we were afraid we would get a tax protester on the next grand jury. That's one of the things that they are doing. That kind of mischief will continue until we get grand juries informed. People on those grand juries, like the grand jury foreman that was fired here by the U.S. Attorney. If the rest of that grand jury had been functioning properly, they would have immediately called in the U.S. Attorney. When the U.S. Attorney tried to fire the foreman, the rest of the grand jury should have immediately called in the U.S. Attorney, put him under oath, and questioned him as to his authority. Where did he get the authority to fire the foreman of the grand jury? You know what would have happened if they had been informed and known? The U.S. Attorney would have been charged with the felony. You see, he doesn't have that authority. You remember now? Where is the authority? Is it above? Yes. It is above the U.S. Attorney. The grand jury has the authority, not the U.S. Attorney. We had a federal grand jury in Salt Lake that handed down some indictments against the Federal Reserve Bank system back a few years ago. They did not understand their position properly. When the U.S. Attorney dismissed their first indictment, they should have indicted the U.S. Attorney. Obstruction of justice. When the judge dismissed their second indictment, they should have indicted him. The grand jury's up here, the judge is down here. What does that mean? It's just like the grand jury here, they're bird colonels in the military. And the judge is some kind of a corporal or a sergeant down here. Now, who has control? Who is in command? If you are in the military and if you had a corporal with an IQ of 80, and I think most of us have seen a few of them, if you had a corporal with an IQ of 80 and you had 1,000,000 privates and all of them had an IQ averaging 130, who would be in command? Not the smartest ones, not the million out there, the majority, no. Because there is an order of authority, there is a chain of command in the military. And it is there so that there is a discipline in the system. And that corporal with his 80 IQ is in command. I know we have former military people here, and you understand exactly what I'm saying. The grand jury is up here. They should not be taking any guff off of these people down here. Back several years ago, they had a special grand jury impaneled in Salt Lake City, Utah, and they had 7 notorious high-profile tax protesters from the West, I was not one of them, that they had targeted. And they spent tax dollars like they were going out of style. They subpoenaed witnesses from all over the United States. A young fellow came out to my house. He said, I've got this subpoena. I have to go to Salt Lake and appear before the grand jury. He was, he was at a loss. He was frightened. He was intimidated. He didn't know what to expect. And so I sat him down and explained the facts of life to him. I said, they don't want you. They're after somebody else. I knew about that grand jury. I knew what was happening. They were bringing in all these people, flying them into Salt Lake, putting them up in the hotels, and they were feeding them and everything else and flying them back home. I said, you don't have any answers to any questions that they're looking for. They're going to ask you a couple of questions, and then they're going to release you and fly you back to Billings, Montana. I said, you have nothing to worry about as far as you being a target. You're not a target. They want to see if you've got some evidence they can use against these high-profile tax protesters out here. So I sat him down and I explained a few things to him. I used the tax audit guide. I showed him the forward by the Commissioner of the IRS. I showed him the section about the the books and records of the individual and how that an audit is. An audit is an illegal search and seizure. It violates the Fifth Amendment. You have to waive your Fifth Amendment rights if you're going to file a 1040. I explained all this, and of course, this was 1984. We had all of the file on the 16th Amendment fraud that had been put together by the farmers, ranchers, and business people up in Montana that called themselves the Montana Historians. I had that file, and I showed him the legislative journals for several of the states and how that they had not ratified the 16th Amendment, the income tax. And then I gave him the file. I gave him copies of my book, Born Again Republic, the one do unto the IRS as they would do unto you, Church Deceived. I gave him copies of all of this, that tax audit guide. I said, you go into that grand jury hearing and take all of this material with you. They're only going to ask you a couple of questions, and then they're going to try to hustle you right out because they've got all these people there waiting to testify. And I said, please, at some point, I said, you've got to play it by ear. At some point, you say, wait a minute. I would like to talk to this grand jury in private without the U.S. attorney, without the prosecutor here. I didn't know if this young fellow, I think he was about 26 or 7 years old, and he didn't know anything really. He didn't know very much. I didn't know if he would do it. I was afraid he'd go in there just shaking in his boots. But you know, he went in there, and they asked him 2 questions, and they were going to hustle him out. And he said, wait a minute. I'd like to talk to this grand jury in private without the U.S. attorney in here. And the U.S. attorney was caught completely off guard. Well, that's up to the foreman of the grand jury. And the foreman of the grand jury said, yes, we would like to talk to you. And he took about 10 to 15 minutes, and he went into that tax audit guide. He showed them what the tax audit guide had to say. He showed them the file on the 16th Amendment material and how that there was a fraud perpetrated against the American people. And then he said, now, if you would like to have all of this material, I will give it to you. And they were so glad to get that material. And he went out the door and came back to Montana. That grand jury deliberated for an entire year and did not return one single indictment. We're confident they spent millions because they wanted to just absolutely devastate the tax protest leadership in the West. And there was a grand jury that protected those people. Why and how? Very simple. They were able to get some truth. They were able to get some information that allowed them to function the way they're supposed to function. I better go on with these questions. Serving on the grand jury is a full-time job. 1 year, every day, 9 to 5. He says, I would love to serve, but I have to make a living. First of all, they pay you to serve on that grand jury. But in most cases, it is not a 9 to 5 everyday type of situation. In Los Angeles, with all the crime you have, it probably is. However, I believe that no matter what the sacrifice is, and if anyone in the patriot community is called for grand jury duty, I would hope that the rest of the patriot community would jump in there and take up the slack and support this individual financially, if at all possible, to make sure that this individual can serve on that grand jury. Because that grand jury juror member has the opportunity to educate his fellow jurors, grand jurors. Just